Hello, I'm Cristina Bandeira, and I'm Professor of Politics at the University of Leeds in the UK. I'm also the Centre of Democratic Engagement co-director and a co-chair of IPEN, which is the International Parliament Engagement Network, which some of you might be interested in to join in. And my research is mainly on Parliament and public engagement. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about how parliaments can enhance the participation of citizens and transparency, particularly thinking of the time of COVID. And the time of COVID is a particularly interesting case to think about. What is the relationship between parliaments and citizens? What is the relationship between decision-making and citizens? And this is because with COVID, we've seen all across the world that governments have had to make decisions very quickly, issue lots of regulations, often with very little scrutiny from parliaments. And often, of course, the main object of those regulations are all of us, citizens. And it's an example of a policy that has had to be developed very, very quickly with no much testing, no much actually prior knowledge. When was the last time we had a pandemic? A long time ago. And yet with effects every day on citizens. And actually, it's those cases that have enabled to have some sort of public engagement with citizens where they have had a better feeling for how those regulations have impacted on the population at large. And so moving forward, it has shown how important public engagement is to ensure not just better trust in institutions, but also better decision making. And so when we ask about transparency and participation, etc., we are very much looking at public engagement, which is a way of referring to all of those concepts, but more than that. It's about making citizens comfortable to approach the institutions. So it's about ensuring that citizens have the knowledge, the information they need, but also that they feel that they can approach, they can say, they can participate, they can have a view on specific policies. And public engagement has never been as important as it is today, 21st century, because of the characteristics of our population, because of lots of things like the way we use media, social media, new media, internet, access of information, circulation of information. All of that means that we are much more, we expect much more to have a say every day, every week, and not just at election points. So although obviously voting in elections are still absolutely fundamental, today what happens in between elections also matters a lot. And this is where public engagement comes in. So public engagement is a term that I realize doesn't exist in many languages, but it refers to things like participation, but also information, education, consultation, communication. And it's from providing the tools to citizens to know how to participate all the way to the actual participation. And more importantly, is about being seen to be listening to the citizen, which is something actually quite difficult for parliaments to do because they're very traditional institutions. And so what we'd like to see is how can parliaments, which are very traditional hierarchical institutions, how can they stimulate this far more? And there's lots of examples happening already. And the last sort of 5-10 years, we've seen many of these examples expanding more and more, from citizens' assembly being used by parliaments to, for instance, on controversial and challenging topics such as abortion, climate change, social care, that sort of decision where citizens' assembly can really have make a huge impact in terms of advancing the arguments and providing the legitimacy to decisions to be made. But also examples like committees organising evidence directly from citizens, and particularly in the case of vulnerable groups, rather than just going to talk to the so-called experts, for instance, talking to people who actually are affected directly by policy making. Now, for public engagement to work well, there's lots of things that go into that, but I only have about 10 minutes to talk to, so I'll divide in two key ideas for it to work well. One is that it needs to be inclusive, and the other is that it needs to be linked to decision-making processes. So in terms of being inclusive, because of the characteristics of parliamentary institutions, they are usually in one capital. They're very far away from lots of people. They're seen as being very elitist and very traditional. That inclusivity does not happen automatically. If parliaments do not reach out specifically to reach to diverse groups, particularly to vulnerable groups, it just will not happen. And what happens instead is that the loudest voice just have even more of a voice. So it's very important for parliaments that want to be more inclusive to reach out to those vulnerable groups. And there's a number of ways parliaments have done that through partnership with charities, civil society, for instance, organizations that are actually working with vulnerable groups. Say, for instance, an example comes to mind is women who are victims of domestic violence. If you think about how do you reach to that group, if you're talking about the policy going through Parliament on domestic violence, it's very unlikely that those women would contact Parliament. So it's much easier, much better to go through organizations that already work with those women. So that's one way of doing that inclusivity. But another way is actually by monitoring who you're engaging with. So a lot of parliaments, although it might seem a very obvious thing, don't necessarily monitor who talks to them. And that's really important because it's only by understanding who is already talking to you that you can then reach out to other groups. One of my favorite recent examples was the work done by the Northern Ireland Assembly on the Bill of Rights, where there's a very strong divide between two communities in that nation, and they only had one of those communities engaging with them, and they wanted to listen to the other side to provide legitimacy to the Bill of Rights. And so they went out of their way to reach out to those groups. And they did also that by looking at the census and looking at where were those people, how many do they need to look at. So that monitoring is really, really important. And then the second element that I mentioned earlier about public engagement working really well is this linking with decision-making processes. So there's no point of doing all the public engagement activities that you may want to do, all wonderful citizen assemblies or wonderful education actions or wonderful consultations if you're not linking that to the decision-making process. That's really, really important. That's what makes public engagement participation valuable. And there's lots of ways of doing that. One of the simplest ways is by involving the members, the politicians, the representatives. They need to be involved in those public engagement activities. It can't be separate because otherwise it doesn't provide the meaning, the legitimacy that it needs to have. There's more strategic ways. For instance, South Africa, the constitution itself states that there needs to be public engagement. There's other ways, for instance, such as the Petitions Committee in the UK Parliament, which puts the petitions, so the citizens' issues, at the core of what it does. So it brings it into Parliament, to the parliamentary debates, and actually has debates about those, which means that those issues raised by citizens are brought in front of ministers and the government and other MPs, and so they can actually discuss about them. They can also do inquiries about that. So that's a really good example of linking public engagement directly with the decision-making process. There's other examples. For instance, Scottish Parliament has done quite a few citizens' assemblies. So citizens' assembly is where you have a sample of the population determined by a number of ways to make it representative of different types of groups. So you make sure that vulnerable groups are also included. And usually the citizens' assembly, they come together, say over 2 or 3 weekends, and they listen to some information and then make decisions about that particular policy. And there's lots of them happening all over the world in lots of different contexts. But what's interesting about some of these examples, such as the Scottish Parliament, is that they actually do it in-house, and they do it linked to committees. So they've had committees who've got an issue, and they thought, actually, it would be a really good issue to do a citizens' assembly. Let's do that. And doing that, and then integrating the citizens' responses and views into their own reports. And there's other examples, like, for instance, in Belgium, 2 legislatures in there already have actually institutionalized this mechanism of citizens' assembly into the political process, into the actual legislature. So it's an actual process of the institutions. So whatever the way it is, it's linked to decision making. There's lots of different ways you can do that. It is, though, completely fundamental for public engagement, participation to work. It's what makes it meaningful. So I hope these sort of 10 minutes give you some ideas, food for thought, for discussions, and I hope I can see you at those discussions and discuss more. But there's far more examples to have, and I didn't intend by here just to summarize everything, obviously, just to raise some of those issues. Thank you, and bye-bye for now.